So hi, this is Gavin from FE News, and today we're going to be unpacking the Apprenticeship Survey. Today I'm joined by Jonathan and Zuza. Jonathan, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi Gavin. I'm Jonathan Mitchell. I'm Deputy Director at the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, with responsibility both for standards development, but also I look after and sponsor the Apprentice Panel in their work.
Thank you, Jonathan. Zuza, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi everyone, my name is Zuza Wnekowska. I'm a final year aerospace engineering apprentice, and I've been a member of the Institute for Apprenticeships Apprentice Panel for about 2 years now.
Okay, thank you, Zuza. So can we talk about the survey? So Zuza, how did the panel decide on what you're going to ask, and how were the responses collected? And also, it was during a very interesting and historic time that the survey went out as well. So I was wondering if you could maybe unpack that a little bit, please.
So yeah, the survey was designed and run by Apprentices for Apprentices, and our aim was to gather a powerful body of evidence to support our work of the panel with influencing apprenticeship policy. So it would help structure what we work on over the next few years. And, we're hoping to do more of these surveys kind of annually. So it was panel members who decided what questions to ask, and that was based on the most important issues we face today. And we focused on training, endpoint assessment, pastoral care, and the impact of COVID-19. And as you said, it was quite a historic time because the survey was open from April 2020 until June 2020, which was, of course, lockdown.
Yeah, no, that's great. Jonathan, in sort of being sort of, very much a part of the panel and sort of the overview for this year, how did you sort of find this sort of moving forward, and what was your sort of aims to sort of find from the survey?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we really value the work that the panel does, and one of the things that we wanted to get at with this survey was to provide them with a really strong evidence base on which to found the advice that they give us. So that they were doing more, I think, than sharing with us their own individual experiences, but rather were able to draw on something that was a bit more thorough, I guess. And so it was great that they developed this survey and delivered it, and they were the ones who made sure that we got plenty of responses and all that kind of thing. So it provided them with a great evidence base. We worked hard with the panel to devise questions that would enable them to elicit views about the products that the Institute approves, rather than just kind of looking kind of more broadly at all aspects of the apprentice experience. It was about like how training providers and employers turn the apprenticeship standards that we approve into real life learning experiences that work. Of course, we weren't expecting COVID-19 to rear its head when we launched the survey. That was a bit of a blow in some ways, and we were worried, I think, that the survey results would be heavily distorted by the impact of COVID. We did add another question to try and draw responses about COVID, and we hoped that most responses would be more broadly about the the experiences of apprentices more generally outside of the kind of COVID period. But inevitably, I think we know that it probably did distort those results to one degree or another.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's also very handy to have that empirical data, really, isn't it? Because we can use that to reflect, the world before COVID, but we're very much in this sort of during COVID time, aren't we? So I think I want to ask a few questions about that in a little bit, but I think it's really important and really useful information to have to understand apprentices' experience during that initial first lockdown, because who knows what is going to happen next. So I think it could be really, really good to see what we could learn from that and how to have solutions to move forward, really. So Zuza, what were the panel's resulting recommendations from the report, and what were the most important to you, and why? Because I know that you had a few pre-recording, I know that you was talking about pastoral care and things like that. So it'd be really interesting to unpack that a bit, please.
Yeah, so there's 6 recommendations based on the survey outcomes. My favourite 2, closest to heart, is more steps should be taken to ensure that apprentices receive their entitlement to the 20% off the job training during their apprenticeship. So we found that, that doesn't always happen. And this has been backed by previous surveys done at the National Society of Apprentices. So we know it's not just a COVID thing, it's a general thing. A lot of apprentices are not getting the training they're entitled to. And then another recommendation, which I think is really important, is guaranteeing minimum standards of pastoral care of apprentices by employers and training providers. We think which they should be defined and delivered. Of course, we have to recognise, especially in the situation of younger apprentices and those with caring responsibilities, that this may be really, really important to have in the structure of an apprenticeship. We have to look after the people in it.
Yeah, 100%. Just in case anyone in the audience doesn't understand what you mean by pastoral care, could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, of course. So the example I always give is if you are 16 about to start an apprenticeship, about to start your go to college, for example, you would have a whole office of people looking after you, looking after your mental health, looking after your well-being, safeguarding, and that doesn't seem to always exist in apprenticeships. So I think it's really important to have that sort of extra layer of looking after people, and especially more vulnerable people.
Yeah, no, very, very, very much. Thanks for unpacking that. Thank you. Jonathan, how about you? What did you sort of see as some really quite interesting results from the recommendations from the survey, and what was really important to you?
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting set of results. Lots of things, as Zuza's described, that perhaps didn't enormously surprise us, but a few that did, I think. The ones that particularly stood out to me were the ways in which apprentices described their experience of being prepared for endpoint assessment. I think that is an area where there's real room for improvement, and certainly that the panel themselves picked up on that in their thinking. It's worth noting, I think, that 94% of the respondents said that they intended to take their EPA. So there's obviously real commitment to EPA as a thing, but only 41% of respondents said that they were satisfied they understood what would be required of them in their EPA, and that's a real worry. Some of your listeners will know that I have a background in education and teaching, and I can't imagine really beginning to deliver a course where you weren't clear right from the very outset what the destination was in terms of the exam or whatever it might be at the end. So I think that's really important, and for me that connects to a wider interest that the panel members have taken in terms of their recommendations in just the quality of what I might refer to, I guess, as teaching and learning. Preparing people properly for the exam at the end is good teaching and learning, but there's a whole load of other elements to that as well. And I think the panel have really identified clearly that they want the quality of the training they receive to be delivered to at least a minimum standard level, and they're working hard, I think, to think about ways of achieving that.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. I think there's two main points I'd like to sort of focus on there. One is 20% off the job, which is, it's a constant theme, isn't it? That seems to be going through longer term when we're talking about apprenticeships, and particularly improving and quality and endpoint assessment. So, Zuza, could we start with your first sort of highlighted point around 20% off the job? Now, we do realise this was a survey during COVID, but like you said, this was a lot of reflection back to be able to say that a lot of apprentices didn't feel that they were getting their allocated 20%. And when we're talking about quality, it's only a bare minimum of 20%, isn't it? We should be aiming for surely more than that. So what would you sort of say could be some best practice or some guidance that you would sort of say to be able to move forward with that?
So I think it's important to define how the 20% should look, and make employers accountable for providing the 20% off the job training. So, one way of doing that is recording it and making sure it's enforced. So when the Education and Skills Funding Agency inspect or enforce the rule, evidence can be provided, to show it's being completed and is made available to apprentices. But also I think it's important that apprentices are able to whistleblow and say, actually, I'm not getting the training I think I should be getting, or my employer is making me work all days of the week and I have to create my portfolio or complete my portfolio in my own time, which is of course not acceptable. So I think it's really important that we stress that these rules are enforced and enforceable, not just on paper, good in theory.
Yeah, no, very much. Jonathan, any thoughts or recommendations that you would say taking from the survey about the 20% and how we can move this forward as a sector? I know that communication has come through as a bit of a theme from the survey, the three-way communication between apprentice, provider and employer. But the next point after I want to talk about is endpoint, which will then be the fourth. But I just didn't know if you had any sort of suggestions or solutions way sort of forward with this, really.
Yeah, I think so. So Zuza's right. I reckon that this is, it shouldn't fall to apprentices themselves to be keeping everybody honest on this one. It's not fair to put them in a position, I think, where they're having to blow the whistle or to complain or to track, these things. This is for the employer and the training provider to do together. And I think there is a general trend in the responses that the panel received that there is more that many organisations could be doing to work better together as employer and provider. This is one of those areas where you might expect providers to hold employers to account a little bit more to make sure that time is being made available. I think equally there are some areas where you'd expect employers to be holding providers to account, and that seems to me to be a really useful thing. And certainly one of the things that the panel has been clear about is where this works really well. We did see examples of that, of course. It's because those three-way discussions are happening regularly and in a positive, constructive way throughout the apprenticeship, and informed by commitments made in the commitment statement, and that apprentices are able to track that they're getting their 20% and all that kind of thing. So I think we would certainly expect to see that happening more, and a lot of that is really, I think Zuza's indicated there that maybe there's opportunities to enforce that in a way, but I think there's also just opportunities to express what good looks like. I think the panel believes, and so do I, that most providers and most employers want to do a good job here, but perhaps they don't always feel clear about exactly what that would look like. So I guess I think in many ways, there's might be a bit of stick, but there's also quite a bit of carrot, hopefully.
No, very, very much. And what I thought was encouraging was that, apprentices, as a part of the role, they are employees, and there seems to be a huge amount of faith in their employer, which is great. And I think it's just sort of, Zuza, Jonathan, it would be, how do we sort of encourage this, more communication, more open communication, so as before it gets to that whistleblowing stage, that we can have sort of early interventions to be able to say, as people understand their responsibilities and roles, isn't it really? How do we enable employers, providers and the apprentice to better not, like you said, Jonathan, it shouldn't sit with the apprentice. They are the most junior member in this here. There's, how can you enable better communication? And Zuza, was there any sort of findings from the panel around that, or any suggestions on best practice on how to encourage better communication?
So the panel, as a result of the survey, we've decided to create our very own best practice guidance to support apprentices, training providers and employers, and it will take all the experience we have amongst us, because we're from all across different occupational routes and different employers, and put together all the recommendations and all the best practices we've seen, and then publish it into a kind of a handbook. So the handbook will provide guidance on what the panel has been told with the survey, and almost like an apprenticeship starter pack, which will lay out things like how training providers and employers can best work together to support the apprentice's well-being, defining what minimum expectations for preparing apprentices for an EPA is, suggesting how training providers, employers and apprentices should come together, how regularly, how a meeting like that should look, and maybe also how we would like to see employers and training providers work together properly with one another in practical terms. So how that could look given real life examples, which is we can draw from the panel, since a lot of us do come from outstanding apprenticeships, and why not share this knowledge amongst other employers? Yeah,
very, very much. Jonathan, any thoughts from your side? I think it's fantastic that there's outcomes from the survey and ways for the sector to move forward. And I wanted to go into more of detail around it, but particularly around communication, any sort of recommendations to better help with these early interventions so it isn't, we're nipping a problem in the bud, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think Zuza's put it really well there. And in fact, the solutions are not rocket science, it seems to me. It is really about building those right opportunities for there to be really good interactions between the parties involved in the delivery of the apprenticeship. And that's very similar, really, to what we were saying earlier on there about, the ways in which welfare and well-being are considered. It just needs the right conversations to be set up so that things can be flagged at the right moments. So I think that's right. And certainly I think that the best practice guidance that the panel is looking at is going to be really explicit in kind of spelling out what individual kind of participants in the apprenticeship, so the employer, training provider, maybe the endpoint assessment organisation, and of course the apprentice themselves, can be doing at particular stages and should be able to expect is happening around them. So I think that seems to me to be the key. All I would say, I guess, is that the panel is doing the work on that best practice guidance. Right now, the work is underway. We're trying to draw in as many different insights and perspectives as we possibly can, trying to lay our hands, I think, on as much brilliant practice as we can find, so that we can weave all of that into it. Your own listeners might have things that they think really ought to be fed into that, and there's an email address on the Institute's website where they can just email that straight into the panel so that we can make the most of it. So we are encouraging all to kind of come to the party on this, to make sure that we really do pull together all the great practice that we know is out there. Yeah,
no, that's great. So can we talk about the fourth part of the relationship and the communication side here? So we've got apprentice with employer and provider, but now endpoint assessment. So endpoint assessment, as you said, Jonathan, in your teaching days, you would never in a million years start to be working with students and learners and not be able to explain what's going to be at the very end of their assessment or in their exam or anything like that. So what were the main findings from endpoint assessment? Because I thought it was very interesting what the survey highlighted, really. So could we unpack endpoint assessment and what the survey sort of found around that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this was a really interesting one. As already mentioned, a high proportion of the respondents said that they were intending to take their EPA, but really a relatively low proportion said that they understood what was going to be expected of them in that. And in the free text comments that we received on this topic, a few really good examples, I think, of the sorts of things people were saying was, one comment said, "I have no experience of endpoint assessments, but I'm due to start mine next week." And one really telling one, I think, said, "What is it?" Which I think is really concerning, and that apprentices shouldn't be in that position. Some of them in their free text comments mentioned, "Well, I'm quite early in my apprenticeship, so I guess it doesn't matter that I don't know." But I really don't think that that's the case. I think apprentices should know where they're headed right from the outset. And in the discussions we've had in the panel thinking about this particular area, one panel member, for example, gave an example of really amazing practice where the first time his EPA was discussed with him was during the course of his interview for the job. Let alone later on from that. And I think that's really good. We've got panel members who are having weekly or fortnightly practice bits of their EPA, and that seems to me to be, that's extremely thorough, maybe excessively so. But whatever the case is, we want apprentices to be feeling totally confident when they get to the endpoint assessment, and it is just really important, I think, that we give a bit more clarity about what that looks like. Let me emphasize, it's not about teaching to the test. That's not what we're saying here. But we are saying, that apprentices need to feel ready and know what it is they're going to be doing at the end. I'm sympathetic. I get that endpoint assessment is still quite new to everybody, but we do need to think about how to prepare apprentices better for that.
Yeah, 100%. So is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm actually going through my endpoint assessment now, and looking back, I wish it was something I've been working towards over the last few years rather than kind of last 6 months. Something I've been more, made more aware of earlier on. It doesn't seem very clear to me who's accountable for providing it, who I should talk to, what it's going to contain, what's actually going to happen. I wish it was kind of sewn into the lining of my apprenticeship, from the very first day, rather than kind of the afterthought, kind of, tick box exercise, what it feels like at the moment. So I see, great potential in improving the way we intertwine the EPA into the core of an apprenticeship.
Yeah, very much. And I suppose that also goes into, again, communication, and also this goes into your original point, Zuza, around pastoral care, because, it's the endpoint assessment is a culmination of, however long you've been on your apprenticeship is the result of that at the end, isn't it? And it's got to be stressful for people to be stepping into a process if you don't know anything about it or what's expected. That's, surely there's got to be a way to be able to better communicate and to pastorally care for our apprentices. I'd like to move on to another point, and it's the timing of the report. And I think it's really, I think it's really interesting that you did that in the height of lockdown when it was chaos. If we look back, it was no one knew, had the clue what was going on, and I can understand why some of the results happened as they did. But I think it's actually really, really interesting for us as a sector to take on board and to look at this and to be able to move forward and not to repeat, really. Because it's overall, the survey was saying that 58% of respondents said that their apprenticeship had been significantly impacted by COVID-19. And what was interesting is that 35% of those who provided a qualitative response, so to actually then unpack that more, said that they'd stopped receiving off-the-job training for some or all of the time of the pandemic, thinking that we could be going into a second lockdown. There's announcements happening every day, regional, national, who knows what's going to happen. What can we learn from that? Jonathan, what would you say we could be sort of taking on board from those results? Because they are understandable, but at the same time, understandably frustrating for apprentices. How can we sort of learn from that and not repeat and be able to move forward?
Yeah, I think it is worth remembering, isn't it, that these reflect basically sort of April and May, so that they're the worst bit of the lockdown in a sense, and when things were quite new, and so it's perhaps not that surprising that a lot of apprentices felt that they. That things had gone on hold for them. And all the impressions that I get are that training providers are in a much stronger position right now to deliver remote learning in really successful ways. And they're a lot more ready to roll that out should it be needed again. Of course, we all hope that won't happen, but you never know. And similarly, employers, I think, are able to provide a slightly kind of more balanced, response right now, and we know that there will still be challenges, of course, if lockdown re-emerges. Certainly, one of the big things that the Institute has done is to try and take a really sensible, pragmatic, balanced approach to flexibilities on EPA, and I think we'll want to kind of keep those in mind. But I think the bit about the results that really struck me, and that I really hope that all training providers and employers will think about if should we find ourselves in that situation again, is how they're keeping the apprentices informed about what's going on. So quite a lot of the apprentices commented on feeling that they just didn't know any longer what was happening to them. They weren't sure when they were going to be doing more or less. They weren't sure how they were supposed to be responding, or how they were supposed to be accessing what they were learning, or what the future held for them at all, really. And I think it's all part of that big pattern, isn't it, in all of this, that the people are not speaking to each other as part of this partnership quite enough, maybe because no one really feels they know whose responsibility it is to be leading on those conversations. I think the panel would say whoever's responsibility it isn't the apprentices to make sure that that's what happens. And there is space, I think, for training providers and employers to really make sure apprentices are kept totally in the picture about what it is they need to be doing next, and especially in really difficult times, which I massively sympathise. This came out of the blue for everybody in a way, but nevertheless, that the apprentices are not forgotten as part of what needs to happen.
Yeah, very much. If we was to dream and dream big, Zuza, what would be your one aspirational outcome to come as a result of the survey?
Definitely to be able to enforce the 20% off the job training. I would love to see every apprentice have the access to the education they're entitled to. And, it's such an important part of your apprenticeship because it gives you the skills to then perform and work. So if you have a strong theoretical background, it gives you really strong roots in the industry. So almost guarantees you success in whatever you do day to day. So it's really important we get that bit right and we get that bit to the best quality we can. Because that gives apprenticeships real meaning.
Yeah, 100%. And, when looking at your apprenticeship, you're personally studying aerospace. Next time I want to get on a plane, I want to make sure you have got all of the routes in place, and someone who is looking after the plane I'm on has got all those skills and theories and understandings in place. I can 100% understand that. Jonathan, how about for you? If you used to dream big and have one positive outcome from the survey, what would be your one that you'd like to have as a takeaway?
Yeah, I'm feeling optimistic about this. I think I agree with Zuza, of course, about the need to secure that 20% entitlement. Absolutely, that's important. But then I think what I really hope, and I think will actually enable that to happen more easily, is for the quality of activity within that to be absolutely the best it can possibly be. I think some of that is around about the ways in which employers and training providers work together to make sure that the on and off the job training are mutually reinforcing and sequenced in sensible ways, and that the right assignments are being delivered at the right times, and the feedback given is really top quality. All those kinds of things that we know really make a huge difference in terms of raising educational achievement. And those things are areas where all the conversation that I've had since the survey results came out, with various stakeholders across the employer and training provider landscape, everyone thinks, yeah, those are things that should happen. So I believe there's the will. What I think we need to make sure we do is turn that into reality, into actual concrete action. I think it's happening. I think it's coming. I genuinely believe in that commitment. But I suppose the dream for me is to make sure we don't lose focus on that, and instead we can look back in 12 months time when we come to have this conversation again perhaps and say, these are all the things that happened and they've made a radical difference, I think.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And thank you both for your time, sir. I think it's a really important survey because what would apprenticeships be without apprentices? And at the same time, this is very much a solution and results driven survey. And I think there's the sector there's the whole sort of ecosystem we need to be taking on board the findings here. And I think one of the main ones I can pick up on is communication seems to be key. And I think a lot of the things which are highlighted between pastoral care, 20%, EPA, is communication. And I think if we can enable the sector to be able to understand their roles in this, if we come back next year and that one's cracked, what a result that will be. And maybe that's my, if I dream big, my takeaway I'd love to be able to see. But Jonathan, Zuza, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for helping us to unpack the Apprenticeship Survey.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having us.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Why not click subscribe so you can be informed when the latest next individual podcasts or podcast mini-series from FE News are going to be released.